policymakers said, "Oh, that's so radical," and so. And now we have done 10 years of work. We have done repeatedly these estimations. We showed and made good cases why inequality is endogenously increasing over time. So today, after 10 years, we still do not have a wealth tax, don't be naive. But we have a very different debate. And I'm, as an expert now, being taken seriously, even though some economists' colleagues still ran out of the offices when I speak to the newspapers and will tell them that I'm an astrologer. So you won't get rid of that. But it's a very different playing field today. So I think this is the main contribution. By broadening the vista, by getting rid of, so to say, seemingly long-held truth, we can make up our minds and think on a blank page. I think that's the main. So not all books, but fresh blank page. I think that's the main contribution here. The other question you ask about democracy, in my view, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. We see that countries that become richer and more equal typically also tend to introduce democratic institutions, and then there is a supposed feedback effect from democratic institutions on growth and equality. It's very different to entangle empirically in this chicken-egg problem what comes first. So I would tend to say that democratic institutions do help, but they are surely not a silver bullet, and very often in history, countries first get rich and then do democracy. In terms of how to use democratic facilities, I think also that democracy as such is not enough. It strongly depends which social movements you have that fill up the free space that is provided by a democratic system. So if these are atavistic movements more, or more nationalistic or ethnically motivated things, are always more difficult than if the social movements are born out of solidarity and interpersonal recognition and non-discrimination principles. That's the historical lesson. So for example, in Europe, where basically unionization was for everybody, we have much stronger social democracy as a historical result as compared to the US, where unionization was always hampered by racial divides. That's the honest thing to say. How to cross the threshold in policy, in international policy making? I don't know. Otherwise, I probably would have already done that. I just think that basically one strategy, one very practical strategy, is to try to question the monopoly of economists, because in the tradition of international policy making and also of domestic policy making, there is a somewhat dubious reaction of policymakers. So as soon as there are numbers and currencies involved, this must be an economist thing. And I think the best approach here is not to change economics. I mean, that's also very important, but it's a very long-run thingy. But it's rather to maybe change these expert circles that do the actual policy counseling and try to have an impact there, which again resonates a little bit with my wealth tax story. So and 10 years ago, newspapers were not willing to write I'm an economist. Today they do. I think that's a victory in these terms. But the idea is really that we have to have a broader representation of disciplines and also a broader representations of origins and personal contexts in these expert committees that, so to say, support policy making. I would argue that this would be a strategy that maybe has some short-run benefits, and we also see it with the South American case, because this UN division in Santiago is regularly providing critical experts, and because there's also some mass of critical experts to draw on, at least the expert discourse, I perceive it very differently from either here or Europe or the US.
Thank you very much, Prof. We will take another round of questions. I have already identified two people that would like to ask questions. And there is a third one. I would love to request that we limit the conversation to the last three, since lunch has arrived. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the presentation. I've had more of the positive in regard to this emerging school of thought, and kindly inquiring if there are some critiques or limitations that have already been identified in regard to heterodox economics, and how can we minimize these limitations in case we adopt it. But I also request you can help us clarify on the applicability and how we can contextualize this, especially in the context of Africa. Is it workable, and if so, under what circumstances? And do you think it's really the most ideal, or is it 100% workable? Because in economics, we always keep some factors constant. Thank you.
Yeah, over to you.
Allow me one more question, please. There was recently an award that was given to the current president of Argentine, by the Friedrich Hayek Foundation in Germany. And I think the head of that foundation is a big economist. And actually, he was my professor when I was an undergrad in Germany, interestingly. So I wondered, can you comment on that kind of affiliation, or why economists seem to like presidents like the one of Argentina with his radical reform, and we do another experiment of social transformation and market extremism, or whatever you call it. So what explains that a guy like this professor makes this astonishing, and his foundation that he leads makes this astonishing decision to award such a controversial figure? What is it backed by by his political position, or by theoretical position, or is it also a particular personality type that grow in your profession? So that would be my interest in why they love such figures and award them, etc. In 2024, where a lot of the neoliberalism has shown, of the neoliberalism hype has shown to be destructive and is discredited in many ways. And yet again, they give this award. My second question is, can you comment just one more time, because you are such an influential figure with the newsletter and the rest, on the link between your profession, the economist, the mainstream, especially the orthodox, and foreign policy? Because we talk about the US journals, the US economists, they dominate, etc., etc. And again, my question about to what extent there's an awareness that this feeds into, and also that they basically promote the line, or informed and shaped by the line of a foreign policy interest of their government, right? We have that debate a bit in African studies, where Ugandan scholar Yusuf Serankuma makes that argument that somewhere that there is a little debate about to what extent a key text in African studies and key figures in African studies, European scholars, right, are informed or deliberately or not, etc., and have links with foreign policy of their home government. So that issue, whether there's something like that also in mainstream economists. Does that make sense?
One more question, Prof. One more question, please. Could you pass the microphone, please?
Yes, thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It was very informative. I got moved by a quotation that if you consider a theory as the only one, it's either you didn't understand it, or you didn't understand the problem that it intended to solve, something related to this. Now that connects directly to the emerging thought, the heterodox, that indeed it is conventionally a necessity to address particular issues at stake. My question would be, what is your take and thought on the readiness of the disciplines, the custodians, I want to call them custodians of the existing disciplines? How ready are they to what extent are they ready to embrace this emerging thought so that it can precisely address the issues that it intends to address? in terms of the absorptive capacity and whatever kind of machinery there is, to be able to embrace it precisely the way it's actually emerging?
Thank you very much for the questions. One more, if you let me. Is heterodoxy important, or does it derive its importance from its opposition to orthodox economics? Or can we make very firm arguments if we disregarded the opposition between scholars from both sides? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe again, taking the last question first, I think that heterodoxy is important, but probably the understanding of an opposition, in my view, is not. The understanding of heterodoxy as an opposition is clearly, in my view, relatively clearly a reaction on experienced dogmatism and exclusion. And this idea of opposition also is a mirror image of the other idea that we should shut the doors towards these guys. And I think really, I'm a little bit tired of this, not because of your question, but as a person, because I'm dealing with this for 2 decades. I think it's a little childish. So you have this dogmatism, and then basically you say everything else should not be discussed. And then there is, of course, a strong emotional reaction. So I'm totally excluded here. But actually, this is not the way to go. The way to go would be to have more serious discourse, to explore the middle ground, and this is probably a good, so to say, opportunity to refer to the first question, because this matters here. No, I think the question was: is heterodox economics suitable as a concept providing tools for transforming Africa, and does it have limitations? Of course it does have a lot of limitations, and of course we always have to discuss these limitations critically, and at least in my view, it's not the case that we can say everything that's printed in some heterodox journal is correct, and anything that's printed in some mainstream journal is wrong. The world is not so simple, so we have to get into a more elaborate, more adult discourse about these things, and I try to make my criticisms of the mainstream as concrete as possible, but at the same time, I am also willing to acknowledge that Roderick has done a good service in exposing how global north-centered economics discourse is, or that Piketty has done a good service in exposing how strong wealth inequality is. These are mainstream guys, so makes no sense to divide into groups and then go from there. It's really about ideas and about the ability to have intellectual exchange on the same level. Then there was the question about the Hayek Foundation and the geopolitical impact. So with the Hayek Foundation, I really have the impression this has nothing to do with neoclassical economics anymore. Hayek Foundation is Austrian school in an authoritarian version. And so basically, you have this, as I mentioned before, you have these 2 sources of neoliberalism, and the Hayek-based approach, the Austrian economic approach. I like to say at conferences, I'm an Austrian by origin, but not by belief. So this is a little bit complicated always with the Austrian School of Economics, but the Austrian School of Economics is a market radical school, but based on very different assumptions. And if you check the site of the Hayek Foundation, you will see that even right-wing neoclassicals left the Hayek Foundations because the Hayekians, the anarcho-capitalists, were too crazy. So I think this is actually something where we really have an instance of this kind of Hayek-inspired market radicalism that is, in my view, distinct from the neoclassical one, although they can be merged, as I said before. With regard to the geopolitical impact economists have, or maybe how their perception and their arguments and their suggestions are also biased by their own geopolitical allegiances, I think a very good example, is given or is emerging, has emerged in the context of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, because basically all those international trade guys in the mainstream, for example, I have a paper out there that says we should do when we do trade negotiations, we should also incorporate a strong element on human rights, basically saying that, okay, it's not only about extending production possibilities, but a trade agreement should also benefit human rights or maybe social protection or something like that. And then always in the media, there was this neoclassical professor who said, no, trade is really about the gains from trade. It's really about production possibilities, and trade policies and trade agreement are about economic things, and they should not be merged with considerations on human rights or social policy. But when Russia attacked Ukraine, the very same guy was in the media and said, now we can do real, hot, nice, exhaustive sanctions. And we can use trade policy as a weapon. This was exactly the wording. We can use trade policy as a weapon. This was the very same guy that told me 3 months before that trade policy should only be about economic things. So if he takes his own words seriously, he should be against sanctions. But he was really extremely enthusiastic about war by other means, as he called it. So it's sometimes hilarious. So this is the one example that comes to my mind. I think that very clearly shows how these political allegiances then have an impact on what happens and what people say. Yeah, and the final question I think was, if I got it right, it was how seriously do mainstreamers take the quote I presented in the beginning? I hope I got it right. And in my view, if you really look at this from a bookworm perspective, purely academically, I think you will find many people within the mainstream that would agree with the quote, but would then say, my responsibility as a serious economist is to first search for a solution within the conventional frame, because then I contribute to solid science. So this is this kind of path dependency. People require an additional push to really go beyond the reference models as printed by the textbook and then, so to say, take a position that challenges them. Many people will say, hey, Papa is right here, but we do it on a stepwise, baby steps. And with baby steps, you of course never leave the confines of the dominant paradigm. You try to repair it from within. This can be fun. It can also sometimes work, but it's basically still a different interpretation about how far to take this quote. Okay, now lunch. Thanks a lot for all the great questions. Really a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Jakob. Indeed, lunch has finally arrived and we can step out and get our lunch. I would like to thank all of you for the questions. I know you want to keep asking questions, and at the same time, we also want to go for lunch. So someone once told me you can't have it both ways. So I guess we're going to have to choose one, lunch or questions. But since we have other presentations later, I suggest we go with the lunch option. Okay. And thank you very much, Professor Jakob. So we invite you for lunch, and then we shall be back for our next session. Thank you very much.
LC the beat guy.
Cause you know, say now you did for my conscience. Now the reason why you did, gotta. Oh, you did, gotta. And anytime you I say, make you give me job, you know, even they try a jara. Oh, you know they are jara, 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 jara. Oh, my licha, one. Waiting there for your list where I know fit to buy you my licha, one. See you, my girl, I swear you they give on me ginger, one. Girl, you they make me crazy, I swear you they scatter my internet. Oh, baby, no go run away. Look in my eyes, you go feel my pain. Don't tell me, say me car on my wrist. Spin me around like a hurricane, no run away. Look in my eyes, you go feel my pain. Don't tell me, say me car on my wrist. Spin me around like a hurricane, no run away.
Baby, I miss you, baby.
I know.
But I'm out here thinking, if you really love me, choose between me and the shorties that you're hiding. They really think that I'm blind. I wanna they do me for one night. Actually, they see me, I'm fragile. If you're there for me, give me your loving. For your sake, honey, I go disappear, honey.
All up in my face, she go keep passing. Come make a jam your machinery.
If you're there for me, give me your loving. For your sake, honey, I go disappear, honey.
Come make us solve your mathematics. Make you go solve my jagbajanti. Oh my licha, one. Waiting there for your list where I know fit to buy you my licha, one. See you, my girl, I swear you they give on me ginger, one. Girl, you they make me crazy, I swear you they scatter my internet. Oh, baby, no go run away. Look in my eyes, you go feel my pain. Don't tell me, say me car on my wrist. Spin me around like a hurricane, no run away. Look in my eyes, you go feel my pain. Don't tell me, say me car on my wrist. Spin me around like a hurricane, no run away.
All right. So we're going to start again. I hope you enjoyed the food and are a bit rested for our final lecture for today. Or actually, we have a final lecture now and then maybe graduate student presentations, is it? After that? Yeah, but we'll see. Now, for now, we're having our second lecture, which is given by Jakob Capella and Howard Stein, whom I shall also introduce to you real briefly, even though you've heard some comments from him already. So besides our meetings on organizing the summer school, the first time that I stumbled upon Howard's name was in a publication where that referenced a paper of his from 1991, which quite amazed me because I was born only 7 years later. But of course it also speaks to the depth of his experience, which he brings to this summer school. Howard is a development economist by education, and he is currently serving as a professor at the Department for Afro-American and African Studies, as well as for the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. But he's also had past appointments at many other universities, so among them, for example, Dar es Salaam, in Tokyo, in Lisbon, and many others. So you can see he's been many places and also partaken in quite some research. His publications and his research interests, I would say, also span quite a variety of topics. For example, some health-related issues like the impact of neoliberalism on health in Africa, or the relationship between health and gender. But then he's also working in economic topics like foreign aid, finance and banking, and also more specifically, for example, on export processing zones or African overpayment on sovereign bond issues. And this list really, like if you look it up, it goes on and on. But yeah, it goes to say, it speaks again to the rich knowledge that Howard brings to this summer school. So we are grateful to have him here and look forward to Jakob's and Howard's lecture on orthodox versus heterodox economic understandings of wealth inequality and its trends.
Hello. Nice. Yeah, hello again. Howard and myself are forming a dynamic duo for this talk, and we will switch places 2 times or 3 times, something about that. And I have the honor of doing the introduction of this talk, while Howard will phase out with a longer story on the history of inequality in Africa. So here's the agenda for this talk. We start by building up some basic knowledge, so some preliminaries on wealth. We introduce the good old stock flow distinction, and on this basis ask how wealth differs from income. We take a short peek on the different functions of wealth. So wealth is typically understood as the sum of assets some entity or individual or household owns, but how to put these assets to use, what to make of these assets is another question, so it makes sense to look shortly what functions wealth can take. And lastly, we inspect the nature of wealth distributions and ask which general properties do we repeatedly observe. I have again put on the slide the rough heuristic many dwarfs, few giants. In a second step, we will then discuss views on distribution in economics and juxtapose a little bit heterodox and orthodox views. How does this specific distribution of wealth, this power law distribution, this many dwarfs, few giants distribution, how does it come about? Why does it emerge in the first place? Why is it so stable across time and space? And then we inspect a little bit what are the typical reasons given for this. And we close by an applied perspectives, by discussing applied questions, very complementary. So I speak a little bit about statistical estimation of wealth inequality as a key tool for assessing the intensity of inequality, especially at the top of the distribution. Howard will take a more grounded view and introduce you to a historically process-based perspective on the history of wealth inequality in Africa, and also how this is entangled with overall questions of development and geopolitical dependencies and so on. So, against this backdrop, let's start with the preliminaries. First things first, funny quote, I found out what economics is. It is the science of confusing stocks with flows. This is a classic statement by Michael Kalecki, and it's of course meant ironically. Important thing in economics is to have order and clarity. What are the flows? What are the stocks? And if we talk about distribution, we typically have one flow in mind, namely income, and one stock, namely wealth. And very roughly spoken, we could say that stocks are measured at some point in time. Here you have as a visual example wealth in 2 points in time, and the changes in these stocks can typically be described by using some flows. In our case, the simplest depiction would be change in wealth between time t and time t minus 1 is given by the income minus the expenditures of the respective household or whatever. So stocks are measured at a certain point in time. Here are some examples: weight of a person, number of students in a classroom, equity of some firm, or wealth. Flows are measured within a certain period: profits of some form, income, GDP, consumptions. And as said, we can represent changes in stocks typically by inspecting flows. Aside from the stock flow distinction, which I assume is familiar to many, we can also differentiate between income and wealth on other levels. So how are these two topics treated as analytical categories and also as an object in empirical research and also political debate? So typically, if you compare this, you would find in public discourses that these two things have different normative justification. Income is very often related to performance. We have already emphasized that there are views that contest this, that would argue that are also other factors playing in here, and one that was prominently visible in the last lecture I mentioned was power relations. For wealth, the normative justification in public debates is typically the reference to property right. Property right is a part of good institutions. Debates on income mostly refer to wages, although that's already something that also could be critically discussed, because by bracketing out capital incomes, as is often done, we also, so to say, bracket out the part of income that brings the greatest inequality in the scene. But very often this is reduced on labor market debates, and the labor market as such is a very well-researched arena. We have many data sources, we have internationally comparable data, especially on wage income, sometimes we are weak on capital income, and also the political challenges that are typically associated with labor markets and labor market participation, unemployment and poverty, are largely accepted as political challenges. This latter story is different for wealth. The sphere of wealth is largely invisible. It's about capital markets, it's about gifts, it's about inheritances, it's about shell companies, firm equity, and so on. So it's a much less transparent arena, or as I put it here, an invisible arena. The political challenge associated with wealth inequality is the concentration of wealth and power, and in recent years we also discussed the very unequal emissions because the very wealthy pollute so much, but these are all challenges that are less accepted in the public discourse. So if we say to a policymaker we should reduce unemployment, this will be fairly easy to convince someone, but a concentration of wealth as a political challenge is something that has to be explained in the first place. And yeah, in line with saying that wealth is a rather invisible arena, we also have to concede that we have worse data sources on wealth. Often data is biased. Often data is only partially available, and data is also difficult to compare internationally because it's difficult to say which country is affected by what biases. As already indicated, these structural differences should be considered, and a final so to say intermediating aspect is this, of course, wealth is a key source of power, and we already mentioned, for example, capital income as one form of how this power emerges. However, we can give a more structured account and ask, okay, what can people typically do with wealth? And there are several accounts and papers on how to do that, but I think a very nice representation is this pyramid, which maps different functions of wealth. So it starts with provisioning. We can use our wealth and consume it or spend it some way, and basically have additional means for consumption or for provisioning. We can maybe make direct use of our assets. If we have a car, we can drive. If we own a home, a flat, or a house, we can use it for living, and this reduces our costs, so we don't have to pay a rent, we don't have to pay a taxi cab costs or whatever. The next step would be income generation. So if I'm wealthy, I can reduce my cost of living because I live in my own house or so, but if I invest in capital markets or in firms out there, or if I lend out money, I can also generate income by achieving interest income or profit income or rent income or whatever. And then, of course, I can use wealth to gain status in society. I can use wealth to transfer it to others. And so to say, at the top of the pyramid, it says power, because if I have very great wealth, I will also have an open ear by those who are mighty in other spheres, let's say political decision makers. So, having said some basic facts about how to conceptualize wealth, and now going over to some stylized facts that we should all know. So one stylized fact that we should all dutifully remember is that no matter where we look, and no matter at what time we look, we will find that wealth inequality is greater than income inequality. And to illustrate this for current data on global income and wealth inequality, I've just put up here this graph. The red bar is the share of income on the left, wealth on the right, that is received or held by the top 10%. And then you have in green the middle 40, and in blue the bottom 50. And this is the typical pattern. So we see that wealth is more concentrated, is distributed more unequally than income, and this pattern holds no matter where we look. Second example, basically saying the same thing. We find that this relationship, wealth inequality is greater than income inequality, also holds for cross-country comparisons. So what you see here is the relative share of total wealth and total income, total wealth on the right, total income on the left, that is received by specific continents or regions or world regions, as it's called in the table. And you probably cannot make it out from the graph, but this graph, because it's too small, but we see here that, so to say, the share of wealth held by North America, Europe, and Eastern Asia is relatively greater than the share of income generated by these countries, and the same at the bottom, the share of wealth held by sub-Saharan Africa is smaller than the share of income. So again, we see this increasing concentration as soon as we turn the spotlight from looking at income to looking at wealth. Another well-known representation of global wealth inequality are these wealth pyramids, where you typically have the bottom 50%, which are, so to say, the base of the pyramid. Then, there are different depictions. This one is based on the fact that we group by wealth. So everybody with a wealth smaller than $10,000 is in the base of the pyramid, which is roughly equivalent to the 50% I just mentioned. And this, about 50% of the population, they hold about 1% to 2% of global private wealth. Then we have the next bracket, net wealth from 10,000 to 100,000 US dollars. There is another 1/3 of the world population in this group, and we find that this group has about 14-15% of global wealth. Then the next bracket is adding another zero, going from 100,000 US dollars to $1 million. This is in this group we find only 11 to 12% of the population, but this group already holds an overproportional share of wealth, as this about 10% of all people hold 40% of all wealth. Then at the top of the pyramid you have those people with net wealth greater than 1 million US dollars. This is a fairly small share of the global population, about 1%, but this 1% holds about 45% of global wealth. And I've put here on the pyramids for 2019 and 2022. And here you see something that I also mentioned in my introductory talk, namely that wealth inequality is endogenously increasing over time, which means that we see a small shift even in these 3 years where the share of the top wealth holders rises and also their consequentially also their total wealth rises faster than those of other groups. So this brings us to a different representation of the same stylized fact. So inequality is growing over recent decades. Here you have the share of the top 0.01%, which is, so to say, 1/10,000th of the global population. And we see that this small group has a share of about 10% of total wealth. And the global billionaires, and even smaller group, has a share of about 4% of total wealth at the end of the series on the left picture. And on the right picture, you see again the rise, the development for the top 0.01%. So this looks quite similar then to the graph on the left. But for comparison, you also see in the graph on the right the share of the bottom 50%, which is basically constant at roughly slightly below 2%. So these are the overall developments on a global level, and of course this stylized fact, this inequality is growing over recent decades, and that the concentration at the very top increases, shows up in multiple ways. So here is again basically juxtaposing the extremes of the pyramid. Millionaires around the world are about 1% of the adult population, and they control 46% of global wealth, whereas those with wealth below $10,000 are about half of global population, but they only own 1% of global wealth. And again, we see this for global. We see that this high inequality also maps on questions of asymmetric development. So the geographical imbalance is quite evident when we, for example, observe that North America and Europe accounted for 56% of total global wealth, but only for 16% of the populations. And also, of course, as a consequence, millionaires are concentrated in North America and Europe. If we look on a more country level basis, for example, here the share held by the richest 10%, we find some variation across countries. And often there is an interesting story to tell. I've already told a little bit the story about Russia, which is dark red, so very unequal. And we will hopefully learn in the course of this summer school something about why, for example, so many red-shaded countries are also there in sub-Sahara Africa. However, there is one safety check to make when looking at this chart. So basically, if we have for some countries like Australia or Spain, we have a measure that the top 10% wealth share is below 60%. I would not believe these measures. So typically, if you look into such measures, you will find there is a measurement problem here. And overall, we can say that the top 10% typically will hold between 60 and 80% of total wealth. That's a very stable pattern for those countries where you can do serious data analysis. So this is also what this chart here tells us. So no matter in which world region we look, Europe, as is well known, is a little more equal than the rest, but overall this all looks very similar. The richest 10% own around 60 to 80% of total wealth, as I just said. The bottom 50% will hold next to nothing, 1 to 4%, no matter where we look. And the top 1% will hold 30% to 50% of total wealth. So the numbers I wrote up there, top 1% will hold between 30 and 50% of all wealth, top 10 will hold between 60 and 80, and the bottom 50 will hold next to nothing. This is a constant pattern that is basically everywhere and also on different scales. It does not matter which country we look at or whether we look at it from a global level or focusing on single world region, it always turns out. So this is a very stable pattern. It's maybe a depressing pattern because the distributional result shows extreme inequality, but at least it's a stable pattern, so it can be maybe be subjected to some analysis. And this is exactly where this leads us. So one thing we should take note of, and which is largely accepted, and which is also accepted within the mainstream, so this is a shared knowledge at least, is that the distribution of law follows a typical pattern. This typical pattern comes with extreme high inequality. We would say that wealth distributions are highly skewed. Technically speaking, we would say that extremely high values appear with very small probability. To visualize that a bit, so if I tell you a story about a tall man I met today, then maybe this tall man was 2 meters and 10 or so. 1.2 times my size. Huh? But if I say I have met a rich man today, if hate were distributed like wealth, and I say I met a tall man today, he probably would have been 200 kilometers tall. Okay? Because this high inequality reaches such extreme proportions. As a consequence, we could say that wealth is more unequally distributed than most variables across all the sciences. And we can summarize this with the quip few giants and many, many dwarfs that has already been used, but we can also trace it visually. And here you see again this picture. So as told before, the left picture mimics the normal distribution. This is the typical idea of a nice behaving variable where there's not too much difference between the mean and the median. For the wealth distribution, we have this property that very high values appear very rarely, and hence the typical values in the population are pressed downward graphically and are close and seemingly close to zero. We also see another property in the graph, namely that the mean of wealth is much higher than the median. In this graph, this is data for Austria, the median is 70,000, the mean is 280,000. Okay? And this is a result from inequality, of course. Because if you have richer people, if richer people get richer, the mean will rise, but the median will stay the same. Making this more technical, we can say the distribution of wealth follows a typical pattern, namely it follows a power law distribution, and this is basically the mathematical version of saying that a distribution has few giants and many, many dwarfs. So we can say it visually, but we can also put it in a formal framework. And I will come back to that in a minute. But this is basically what you should know before we go into the different views on inequality. So there is this stable pattern, very high inequality, power law distribution, extreme values at the upper end, and the question is now, why is this the case? And if we would give a rough overview of the two visions, orthodox and heterodox, we could say that from an orthodox perspective, we would say wealth is a result out of savings. So what matters is income, and what matters for income is performance. And then we are back to the story. If you perform in the market, marginal productivity theory holds, you will get a wage that meets your performance, your contribution, and from that wage on you can build wealth if you make the right choices, if you save, if you do not spend too much on fancy consumption items, if you're disciplined, work hard, that's the story. Then you can build up wealth. if we, so to say, simply look at the resulting patterns of inequality, we would say, okay, then this inequality is simply the result of productivity differentials and differences in lifestyle choices, and hence it's okay, and also it has no important consequences for economy and society. From a heterodox perspective, we would say that wealth does primarily emerge from wealth. Wealth is a result of inheritances, of gifts, and of assets I already has, and by exploiting the power asymmetries that come with existing assets, I can increase my wealth. And this is the idea of cumulative advantage. So my next year's return will depend on my assets today. And sometimes this is also called positive feedback effect, as in the last lecture, and sometimes this is also called a Matthew effect, with reference to the Bible, where it says that those who already have shall receive, and those who have nothing shall also lose that. So, it's a very common expression, actually. So Matthew effect is a form of positive feedback effect in any reward-based system. It can be related to visibility in the literature, in citations or something like that, but also can be related to wealth. If you view it that way, then accumulation is a historical process and is to be understood as such. And this would also explain why we have persistency of stratification, persistent classes, and why we have path dependency in the social status of individuals. And yesterday we had a very nice talk about how maybe new venues on the internet might, so to say, give a platform to break up some of these path dependencies. And in the heterodox view, where roughly spoken, this resulting inequality has consequences. It leads to social cleavages, and it has adverse economic impact. Okay, this would be the rough juxtaposition of these philosophies, and we will now go in greater detail. First, Howard about the orthodox view, and then I will do a short comeback on the heterodox view.
The space bar, right? That one, okay. Thanks, Paul, by the way, for your warm introduction. I think from listening to all the things I've worked on, you say, why does he work on so many things? It's probably boredom. You know, my attention span's low. I work on a subject, said, okay, I'm done. I want to move on to something else. So it's not necessarily a positive thing, but it is what it is. Okay, so I want to now continue. There's two things I want to emphasize from the data that was presented, basically, by Jakob. One is there's an enormous divide, which is much higher inside of African countries. And two, there's an enormous divide between Africa and other regions in wealth versus income. So roughly 10 to 1 on income. If you looked at the early slide 8 that he went forward, I won't go back to it, roughly 20 to 1 on wealth. And it really says something about what's going on internally, what's going on externally. What is the dynamic relationship between the internal transformations and relationships and the external transformations? And the center of this is something that I want to begin to discuss in a more systematic manner. Again, you know, I have to give my editorial comment on neoclassical economics still, okay? So bear with me. I'm hard-hitting Howard, HHH. So basically what we have here is the issue in neoclassical economics and wealth distribution. The one thing I want to emphasize before I get into this is by nature, neoclassical economics is not interested in wealth for some of the reasons that Jakob said, but also by assumptions. You know, markets are simply a product which has nothing to do with initial endowments in general equilibrium theory. Why do you have to look at it? It's not important. You know, it's just what the results are. You know, it's just that individuals are maximizing utility in the analytic. And so in some senses, then we'll see they're very much against the idea of redistribution. It was embedded. Not so much, they don't discuss much these days, but it was embedded in my head when I did my undergraduate degree in economics at University of Toronto a couple of years ago. So what we have here then is this idea that you know, wealth and income is what people get and deserve, right? There's nothing to do with it. It's the natural nature of the market. You know, income, education, key driver. We got that talk this morning about wealth, you know, in the context of different types of capital. But as we see from a heterodox perspective, It's much more complex. It has to do with power. It has to do with consumption, standards of living. There's a whole series of aspects of it which go well beyond the issue of simply, well, wealth is just a potential application to different types of capital. And it's a whole other discussion about how flawed the idea of applying capital, like social capital, to understand social analysis. It's just this, it's what I call the imperialism of neoclassical economics, grabbing what should be sociology theory and saying, hey, we can interpret everything in the world, with our neoclassical framework. Now, that's the other problem, is this hegemonic impact of neoclassical economics. Okay, so wealth then basically, it's kind of has to do with talent. It's what people deserve. It's a natural process. And it even gets to the point where we can understand wealth and inequality by the work of Simon Kuznets. And it's amazing to me on how you read through these different theories, and they're flawed relative to the obvious empirical analysis, and then they spend all sorts of ways to reinvent, to maintain the existing original analysis, like Kuznets, like the Lucas paradox, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Kuznets basically said, inequality, it should be lower in Africa than the world. And we saw it's in quite close to actually Russia, the inequality we have in wealth inequality, compared to Russia. We know it's with a very different history. And so Kuznets says, well, Africa's going to has low industrialization and high reliance on agriculture. It should have an equitable distribution of income. What's the reality? Unfortunately, it's not the case. So where does this come from? It comes from the same flawed microeconomic analysis that simply says, in neoclassical theory of distribution, which is a marginal productivity theory, factors of production in a competitive market are supposed to be paid according to the marginal contribution of production. It's such a core element. How many people have economics classes here? Anybody? Had like mainstream economics classes? That's all there is in Africa, guys. So, okay, okay. So you've been spared it, fortunately. But okay, so no, I'm joking. No, I'm not. Okay, so what we have basically is, so the argument is peasants receive income commensurate with their land and labor, which is comparatively equitable in economies dominated by rural production, and hence with industrialization, the divide between the urban-based wage income and rural income will grow. Income inequality will worsen. Only then, with the shrinking of the rural sector, will you get greater inequality. So it's supposed to go equal income, unequal income, equal income. And this was Kuznets' observation on development. Well, that hasn't happened. In Africa, we have massive inequality, right from the beginning, in a heavily rural economy. And this comes from this incredibly flawed theory of the marginal product theory of distribution. Free competition, as I said, tends to give labor what labor creates, to capitalists what capital creates, to entrepreneurs what the coordinating function creates. Hence, you're getting what you deserve. Entrepreneurs, they deserve that income by nature. It has to be by marginal productivity theory. You heard this notion of Euler's theorem this morning, that all the factors of production add up to the total, and the theory is in the constant theory of returns. Well, it's nonsense to discuss that, because it has to do with existing structures of power. But it is this notion, which is so importantly ideological and so important for the neoclassicals, to sit there and say, well, you're simply getting what you deserve. Why are we talking about inequality? People get what they deserve. Because by nature and by definition, the invisible hand of the market ensures that the income received is equivalent to the value you contribute to the factor of production at the margin. The problem is, it's nothing but pure fiction. There is no basis in reality, but it gets taught in every single microeconomic class in Africa, in the United States, and every other country in the world where you have domination neoclassical economics, which is pretty well everywhere. And so the problem is that factors of production are integrated, and their ability to affect production, basically, is completely contingent and interactive, something that heterodox economics realize. And hence, there's no clear-cut measurement of what, in essence, is the marginal product of a particular factor. And so, at the same time, other contributed factors are absolutely overshadowed. And so, what we simply have, and this is typical of neoclassical economics, you're taught, you're embedded with this ideology of the beauty of the market. You come out with, and how the market's all satisfied, homo economicus, maximizing the utility, but it really is simply a normative argument dressed up in science, And it gets even further, because then in the work of Oken in 1975, he argued simply, you cannot deal with income distribution. The very act of carving up